Hey everyone, my name is Andre, and today I got the chance to talk to Marshall Kosloff of the Realignment podcast. Marshall is one of my personal favorite creators, and his content has really impacted the way that I think about history and politics as a whole. Marshall has had a really big influence on the direction of this channel, so if you enjoy my videos, I guarantee you will enjoy what Marshall has to say. This is my first interview on the channel, and I would love to hear if you guys had any feedback on it because it's a format that I really enjoyed, and it's something that I would love to continue pursuing in the future. But without further ado, here's my interview with Marshall Kosloff. Hey everyone, and welcome to the interview with Marshall Kosloff. I'm very excited to be joined by you today. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, I'm pumped to chat with you. I really like the work you do, and I think we're in a cool space together. So let's do it.
Oh, thank you. I'm a really big fan of your work. So for anyone who isn't aware of what you do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you've been up to?
Yeah, so I do a bunch of really cool things, actually. So I am a kind of academic podcaster in that I work at the University of Texas at Austin, but I also host a podcast called The Realignment. I host another podcast called The Arsenal of Democracy at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And I also just do a bunch of things like all over YouTube, sometimes with breaking points with Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball. So I'm in this weird position where on the one hand, I'm a content creator, so I like putting things out there. I record like 3 or 4 episodes a week. But because I work in academia / think tank world, I like focusing my work around like useful topics. So, hey, like how history can help us understand the world that's happening now. Hey, here's this like deep dive into healthcare and the reason why reform hasn't worked in the past. So that's the real way of like understanding me and my work.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, actually. And I think that you articulated really well what I think makes you so compelling as a content creator is I feel like you're a very sort of sound voice and you're a very good interviewer in that way because you can be more inquisitive about certain topics that I think just comes across in a very unique way that I don't think I see in other places.
Yeah, and the kind of problem with that is I'm not a great pundit, in the sense that like my because the thing, and you're doing an interview here, so you understand this, but when you're doing when you're interviewing someone, all your basic job is to do is just to kind of like read their work and be aware of the space and just be interested and like listen and like respond when they say something. But when you're just a pundit, like you've got to look straight to the camera and just have like a take. And it's not useful to be like, well, on the one hand, like on the other hand. So it's just because I've done all these things across all these different worlds, I've had this really helpful like 5-year journey of thinking like, okay, like what do I enjoy? What do I not enjoy? And how do I kind of like take my career in a way that's kind of useful?
Yeah, I think that actually leads very well into the next question because I was going to say recently I've heard you describe yourself as more of an academic and less of a traditional media person. I found it interesting to hear you talk about how that's made the realignment a little less about getting views and more so just about having conversations with interesting people that you can learn from. Just to get a sense from where you're at, can you tell me a little bit about how you got there and what that distinction really means to you?
Yeah. So the quick thing to note is Sagar and Jetty and I launched the realignment like right before COVID in 2019. And then we took it independent from the Hudson Institute in June of 2020, which was also right when Sagar went on Joe Rogan the first time. So like the timing was just perfect there on 2 levels. So level number 1, because we went from in-person to virtual, it meant that you could just book anybody then. It wasn't about saying like, hey, if you're in DC on the specific day, you come to this specific think tank's office that you may or may not like in terms of like the think tank being like a center right conservative think tank. So just hopping on Zoom was just a game changer for us. But then B, because Sagar went on the JRE, numbers on the podcast just kind of exploded. And then he just started doing really well with The Hill. Then Breaking Points went independent. So like we just we're consistently growing. The more and more we made the realignment, basically long form Breaking Points or long form The Hill. And we had a lot of guests that kind of fit into that category. We also had this thing going on where a lot of people were interested in the realignment topic because they were interested in this idea of like, especially younger viewers who like breaking points in the hill of, hey, like it turns out that left and right, they don't mean anything because these words are changing and everything's changing. And it could be that there's this like new populist revolution coming, which is going to completely transform both parties in ways that people would probably really like. So that narrative in itself is just like very useful to people. So where do we stand here in a way that gets to your question? So number one, I think that narrative just like wasn't true. Like start from there, right? Like it just is not true that a populist revolution is fundamentally transforming both parties. There's obviously been serious like populist features that have impacted both parties for sure, right? Like Republicans on immigration and trade, Democrats, like when it comes to like Elizabeth Warren, people coming into the Biden administration, and Biden probably being one of the most like left on economics, presidents we've had since the LBJ era. You see this in the, Labor Relations Board, and you see this with like Lena Khan at the FTC. But that's different than these labels no longer mattering, because once again, you have the abortion decision, which just takes us back to the politics of the 2000s and 2010s. So you can't argue that, oh, we're in this realignment and nothing matters when you have these massive elections that are basically decided by abortion politics. So that's the quick point too, which is that I just am not interested in basically shilling a fake narrative about populist remaking everything if it's not true, which definitely I think hurts the show's identity, because rather than me saying, oh, Andre, like, here's the deal, man, like, come to my show if you want to learn why like your old boomer grandpa doesn't matter anymore. Because that's basically like the old realignment, old breaking points pitch. When I'm actually saying like, actually, it's kind of, he really does matter. And actually it's complicated. So that's part one. Part two, I can do numbers if I want to do numbers, right? Like, so if I want to break hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views on an interview topic on YouTube, it's pretty straightforward. There are just certain topics that are certain, I'm not going to really like name names here, but who are just going to like just do numbers. What I kind of found was that the more I did that, the less I was intellectually satisfied, just because if they're doing numbers on YouTube because the algorithm likes them, they're already like getting covered a bunch of other places. So for example, like Peter Zion, I put that episode out. I woke up the next day and had 400,000 views, just because like Peter Zion, the algorithm loves Peter, and he's a great guest. He's like very entertaining. He's been on Joe Rogan. But the thing is, like, a bunch of people just do Peter Zion interviews, right? I had Neil Howe who did the Fourth Turning book, 150,000 views. Once again, like the next day, he did a bunch of like media tour interviews. So the more I kind of just focused on these more like niche topics where you're like going really deep on something, the more I was just personally learning and the more I was actually kind of providing value. So I think what I kind of shifted to here to end this like really long answer was I am coming from an academic space, which means I'm funded by grants. So I don't make money. So I have a subscription for the Realignment, but I use it to pay for our producer. So that's not how I'm making my money. I make money because like the Heal Up Foundation and like the Hudson Institute are like, hey, Marshall, you're smart. We like your work. We're going to support you. So it means that like I'm just totally divorced from needing to ride the algorithm or do whatever's going to kind of maximize advertising. So the thesis of the show right now is really like, hey, there's all this noise out there. You might not think this is like the hottest, sexiest topic, but actually like a year or two from now, you're going to be really thankful that you listened to an episode on the defense industry or an episode on Taiwan. Like my priority is kind of getting people who are like in power and needing to do their jobs well to like listen to the show, because that's where I could have the most impact.
I think that's a great answer, actually. And I want to touch on a couple of the things that you mentioned there, because I think you did a really good job of sort of placing the political moment that we're in and not, I guess, giving too much credit to the sort of populist right, populist left rhetoric that we might have found compelling in the last couple of years. I think that's something that I really appreciate about your content, particularly, is I would describe it as very nuanced. I think that you don't really let your own personal bias or political feelings get in the way of what the reality of the situation is. I think you're a very good analyst in that way. And I remember even when I started watching your show, I thought that you were a very hard person to place politically because of that, because you do a good job of sort of recognizing the nuances of every argument, So, and on the in terms of what you said there about how politics in some ways has changed, but in other ways we're still having the same debates, I actually wanted to bring up that on Tuesday I attended a talk given by George W. Bush, and it made me think about this interview in more generational terms. Being there in that auditorium felt like kind of going back in time and seeing this performance from a bygone era of politics. My own political awakening was very defined by the Trump era. I was about 15 at the time of his election, and Bush and Obama were kind of at the rearview mirror. I'm curious to hear about your own formative political moments and get your own perspective on what it was like to live through the realignment we've seen in the last couple of years, no pun intended.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say a couple moments are formative. So obviously 2016 is formative, I think, for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those once in a century events like Trump surprise winning over Hillary that I think no matter what generation you're in, that's going to either form you or it's going to shift you. And what that really was transformative for me around was just realizing, oh, whoa, generations that came before us, made a bunch of really big mistakes. Right. So like
Mm-hmm.
a thing I'm really obsessed with, and I want to like kind of develop this out on the podcast next year, is this idea that the 1990s, I'm sure you've probably heard the like Francis Fukuyama, end of history, like all that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the idea was basically the Cold War is over, the Berlin Wall has fallen, and liberal democracy has just proven to be just like the best system, which I think is 100% true still. But that basically leads an entire generation of politicians, policymakers, and even just like voters to basically go on autopilot and then make all these mistakes across all these different categories. Like if it's the defense industry, it's the Pentagon basically saying, hey, we're not going to support 50 different companies. This is the episode that just came out today on December 7th. We're not going to support 50 different companies. Instead, what we're going to do is like radically cut the funding, which in some ways is a good thing because you're like obviously not going to spend Cold War levels of money, and it'd be good to take the money and put it towards what they call a peace dividend. But they do that, and that leads to 5 big companies remaining, which leads to like monopoly conditions. So the prices go up, they're less efficient. And then those companies themselves become much more driven by Wall Street. So they're much more focused on like financialization and not actually focused on actually achieving what we need the military to basically do. So that's an example of a mistake there. But there are all sorts of like, this is like financial deregulation. This is like bad politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just understanding for me that 2016 was just like the culmination of the failure of the George W. Bush generation and the Bill Clinton generation, they're similar ages, to handle those 2 decades, the first 2 decades of my life properly. And the way I see 2016 to basically 2028, because this should be referred to as this long Trump era. I think when we take a step back and look at like history at the end of the century, this will just be the era of Trump. Because even if Joe Biden wins re-election, which I think he stands a more of a decent amount, I'm way more bullish on his chances than the polls would suggest. He would only win re-election because of whatever Trump did or whatever Trump was. So even a victory in 2024 would represent a person who's responding to Trump. So Trump still defines the era. And I just think this political moment, once again, 2016 to 2028-ish, is basically political actors in American society trying to work through that Trump election in 2016. And that's also why my kind of position is take a step back, analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think so many people who have just dove all the way in with their takes, with their like, we're democratic socialists or we're like the new right. And there's this pop, like, once again, I'm hitting a theme here. They've just been wrong. So I think what I'm most interested in is like building content and doing intellectual work that helps someone left, right, or center wake up in 2027 and actually build a responsive politics that is long-term sustainable.
Yeah, I think I really fundamentally agree with the point that you're making there, because I think so many people can sort of get ahead of themselves and try to make a big deal and try to overanalyze some situations instead of just seeing that clearly our politics are still very much just defined by Donald Trump. I really like sort of sort of this narrative of looking at Trump as a new Reagan, not in the sense that they represent the same space culturally, but just to the extent that they define the Republican Party. And I think that that sort of language about framing the Trump era has been very helpful. I think that no matter what, our politics has just been very centered on him, and that seems like a space that we're not really going to get out of anytime soon, despite the people currently running for the Republican nominations lack of trying, you know.
Can I ask you a quick
I
question?
Oh, sure.
What do you? I'm curious from your generational perspective. What do you think about Ronald Reagan? And I'm asking you this because of your LBJ videos. I'm not asking you to kind of like comment on his individual policies. I'm kind of asking on a like presidential history level, because for me personally, the more I've learned about like the presidency and presidential history, I think the more compelling I found Ronald Reagan, in the sense of his talent as a politician, his ability to like actually personify this morning in America idea. Because it's kind of funny, like Joe Biden has tried to do that. He's tried to do the same thing, but from a left direction, and he hasn't been able to pull it off, which has just convinced me that there's a skill set here. You know, there's like an actual like ability as a politician. So I'd just be curious of what you think about that.
Yeah, I love that question actually, because one of my favorite episodes of the Realignment was the one where you featured Jonathan Darman and his book
Yeah.
Landslide. I really, really
Dude,
enjoyed
so many
that
people like, I'm so
episode.
glad you said this. People really like that episode. So I'm glad I always hear
Yeah.
about that one. I'm glad about that.
Yeah, I've got Landslide right over here next to my desk, so
Yeah.
I've got you to thank for that. The way that I see Ronald Reagan, I feel that that book and the interview that you did on it really helped me look at Reagan from one more objective sense and really appreciate the sort of politician that he was, just from a leadership perspective. I think that well, I did a video based off of Landslide called The Last Great President that sort of looked at FDR and looked at LBJ and Ronald Reagan carrying on different parts of his legacy, like the book implies. Sort of the LBJ with the legacy of the politician versus, I mean, LBJ with the legacy of the policymaker versus Ronald Reagan with the legacy of the politician. And I think that really does just come down to the great communicator stuff. I think that Reagan had a unique generational talent for charisma and for speaking, whether that be from being an actor or just from his own personal qualities. I think that that ability to communicate is something that, like, as we become a more media driven people, I think that that's something that's going to become more and more important for our leaders. And that's when you get to the problem, because someone who's a good communicator isn't necessarily going to be a good chief executive, you know? Like LBJ might not be the most personally like charismatic person of all time, but he can, you know, get his policies through. And I think that's something that if you look now, sort of Donald Trump kind of created his own version of that Reagan communication, not in the way that it can sort of unify the country necessarily, but just that it energizes the right group of people and he can get his message through in that way. And I think that's something that the Biden administration in particular is really struggling with. Like, I've had a really hard time just looking at them sort of go through this like weird trying to make him FDR and then trying to say Bidenomics. And I think that's just something that doesn't really land with anybody. I don't really know who that in particular is supposed to be marketed with. And in a lot of ways, I think that also kind of feels like harkening back to that old style of politics, which in a way is sort of Biden's strength. But I think that in terms of his communications department, I think it just sort of comes off as wrong. I don't think it really hits the way that they want it to.
Yeah, and I think that before we get back to your questions, because this is just like a really helpful frame of understanding the moment, the thing that Reagan was just able to do, and once again, I didn't really appreciate this until I kind of took a step back from debating his individual policies. He clearly was able to make a broad majority of the country, after like a really tough 1970s, like feel good about itself, but also its ability to do things. And if we're looking at like the actual like malaise and like lack of confidence that various generations in America have today, I think whoever is able to build a sustainable politics that moves us out of this like post 2016 Trump era, for good or for ill, it's going to be someone who has like a similar ability. So that's why I just think it's really funny because and look, like President Obama, like he's obviously a smart guy, like he gets this. Like in 2008, like he famously praised Ronald Reagan for this very dynamic, and it was controversial because Hillary Clinton was like, oh, he's praising Reagan, he's, you know, saying he supports neoliberalism and like conservatism. But what I think Obama understood, I think what we both understand, and I think clearly Jonathan Darman's book understands, is that there's a certain style of performance of the presidency that really, really, really matters. And you really need to be able to bring that to the table. So that's like really interesting. But yeah, come on, back on your plate. I kind of took over the interview for a second there.
Well, that actually made me want to follow up on that question. I think that Obama is clearly like a once in a generation sort of politician. My question for you would be, why do you think he sort of fell short of being able to be that sort of unifying Reagan type figure in that way? Like, I feel he expected that for himself, and I don't think he really saw coming the amount of partisan hatred that was going to be there.
Yeah, it's a great way to phrase the question. So look, something I'm obsessed with when it comes to history is kind of how much is a leader able to accomplish based on the individual merits and talent versus the political moment they're kind of thrown into. So I think in many ways, and this obviously wouldn't have worked for racial reasons, but like take aside, no, let me put it this way, put Obama in 1990s style, a 1990s style political situation, I think he would have had a much better presidency than he had. And the reason why I say he would have had a better presidency in a 1990s style condition is 1990s, it's not just like smooth sailing, but like everything's like pretty under, like obviously you have the Republicans win in the midterms of 1994, but like aside from that, everything's kind of just like under control. It's moving in a straightforward way. It's predictable. You have your ideas and you just kind of implement them. For the Obama presidency, everything is about black swans, like things from out of left field. So, you know, Obama is running for president starting in, 2007. And it seems like what he's going to do is be a response to the Bush years. There's no red America, there's no blue America, there's United States of America. There's a George W. Bush who, for some reason, decided to take the chillness of the 1990s and just make everything super divisive. Obama's entire 2007 campaign is basically, hey, like, let's kind of bring that back. Let's kind of get along together again. Let's like work to do big things. That is really effective for him. However, late 2008, financial crisis happens. Okay, that entirely upends his entire presidency. Like obviously people, especially left-leaning people, could critique the Obama response to Wall Street. They could critique all these different policy choices he made. The Obama presidency was not supposed to have spent its first 2 years muddled in the aftermath of a financial crisis. So that's part one. Part two, Obama was supposed to pull us out of Iraq. And he did pull us out of Iraq. Like Obama's like one of the main reasons why Obama beat Hillary in the 2008 campaign is because in 2003, he gave that speech opposing the Iraq war when Hillary Clinton voted for the Iraq war when she was New York senator. So he's the pull us out guy. Okay, we pull out. It's 2011. That's great. Uh-oh. A few years later, you have in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, you have the Syrian civil war, and you have the rise of ISIS, and we have to pull back into Iraq. You see a presidency that was about like moving us on in like a straightforward trajectory, just constantly be pulled back. And then another example of this too, 2014, the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine and seizure of Crimea. That was very much not supposed to be the world that Barack Obama was president over. And I also just think that he's not only not as interested in foreign policy, I think on a personal level, but I also don't think he was a foreign policy president who was forced to mostly consequentially deal with foreign policy problems. So I think that's like the unfortunate reality where I'd have a hard time blaming him for anything like very specifically, because these are just tough choices and tough trade-offs, but he just was not served by, and once again, also sometimes like things that happen are a result of his decision making. So I'm not pretending he's just like this actor where, you know, the universe is sending bad vibes his way. But I am saying that this was just like not exactly the presidency that he aimed for. And we should really understand like that's the reality.
I love that answer because I think especially the back half of it really made me think of LBJ and Vietnam in particular, that sort of foreign policy getting in the way of your domestic agenda. And I think that's actually a perfect segue into my next question, because the realignment really helps me understand that it takes more than just good ideas to get something done. I feel like you really highlight the importance of political talent and leadership that's best suited for the situation that they find themselves in. I think Robert Caro put it best when he talked about LBJ pulling the levers of power. For the sake of the premise, let's say we had a modern day Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt. In our current political system, do you think they would be able to execute public policy and pull those levers of power in the same way? I guess the broader question would be whether the political problems of today are attributable more to systemic issues or a leadership issue.
Another great question. So here's the thing though, like if we're talking about LBJ and FDR, the key thing here is they had majorities. So it wasn't just that LBJ and FDR had the skill sets to wrangle the legislative branch and run their executive branches. They had political majorities. Now, when it comes to LBJ, his political majority is kind of complicated because, like, obviously he blows out Barry Goldwater in 1964, but there's a question of how much of that is attributable to, you know, JFK's assassination the year before. Like, obviously Barry Goldwater, I think, was always almost certainly going to lose because he was deeply out of step with the country. Whatever. This is me doing on the one hand, and on the other hand, I said I'd do at the start of the episode. All that said, no, here's the thing. I'm not gonna reject the premise, but I'm just gonna say this is how it kind of works. You need two things. So you need a politics, a coalition, and a theory of the case that provides you with a majority. The majority need to pass legislation. And then you need the individual political talent to navigate those sets of conditions and sets of challenges. So I think a FDR certainly, and I'm not quite sure about LBJ, but an FDR certainly, I think, would have the political talent to build the coalition and present the theory of the case that could provide them with the majority they need to actually win the presidency. And then I think they would be able to, in certain respects, but actually, no, I'll push back on this. Like, this is why this is, I want to hear what you think about this. I think that right there, even in the premise of your question, you've articulated the problem. I do not think this era is an era defined by systemic change. Like, there are different eras in American politics that like provide different opportunities. And I actually think this is an era where it's not about like changing the system. It's actually about correcting humongous mistakes that were made and then providing the foundation upon which someone could build something broader. So, for example, what has consistently destroyed Democratic presidencies and could destroy Biden's presidency? The southern border, immigration. Like, immigration has been this consistent issue that consistently upends Democratic presidencies. If I were in the Biden White House, which is a bigger priority for me, a Bernie Sanders Gen Z friendly systemic change approach, or hey, if we're going to win in 2024, we need to like figure out how the border could appear to be in a sustainable space so we don't get immigration backlash. I think that's an example of where you should be focused on. And also, here's the thing too: Biden, Obama, those aren't systemic change presidencies. And guess what? Like, we also haven't voted. Like, the Democratic electorate, I know it's easy in 2020 to kind of do the breaking points thing. It's like, oh, like it was stolen. And Obama like placed all these calls and made everyone screw over Bernie. Like, no, like the vast majority of the Democratic Party's electorate was not endorsing the idea of systemic change. They were identifying, hey, we don't like Trump. We're going to support whoever doesn't support Trump. And that was a Joe Biden presidency. So I think the moment is more. I think what an FDR and LBJ will be doing right now is say, we're going to build a majority that's premised on fixing the problems of our country right now, and it's to another politician after we fix these underlying problems, after we've plugged these leaks and these holes, to actually change, let's say, maybe the Supreme Court or the Electoral College or like social democracy. Because I think if you're a politician and you look at the world of the 2020s and you think you're going to win office by like making this broad systemic change pitch, we've run this experiment for a couple years. It's not going anywhere.
I think there at the end, you touched on something that I really wanted to ask you about. I'm forgetting which episode it was. It may have even been multiple episodes of the realignment, but I've heard you talk about how for about the last 30 years, the American people have consistently elected the change candidate from Bill Clinton, George Bush, like Barack Obama, Donald Trump. I think it was from George H.W. Bush being the last like non-outsider candidate to Joe Biden. I think that really speaks to what you're articulating there, the sort of like return to normalcy over this sort of like revolution that people my age might be inclined to talk about politically. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit on why you think that change candidates were so popular in the last few decades and why not now.
Well, I mean, it depends because, oh, great. Change candidate doesn't equal systemic revolution candidate. That's the flaw in the premise. So key thing, George. So let's actually start it. Let's start right. So George H.W. Bush, we win the Gulf War, just great military victory over Saddam Hussein. Low American casualties, good to go. His approval rating like goes into the high 80s. Low 90s, highest ever recorded presidential approval rating. The economy starts to falter, and Bill Clinton comes in, not saying, hey, like we need to convert ourselves to a social democracy. Hey, like we need to do all these big things. Just, hey, George H.W. Bush is a foreign policy president. Good job on the Gulf War. Good job on ending the Cold War like peacefully. Terrible job on the economy. You've done your job. We need a person who's going to focus on like ma and pa and like middle class economic issues. That is the definition of a change candidate. 2000. People are pretty happy if America in the 1990s. I mean, George W. Bush also doesn't win the popular vote. So like the whole like this is kind of interesting. But like the reason why he gets close and obviously wins is because he makes this case of like, look, what if we could have kind of the stability of the Clinton years without like the sex and without Monica Lewinsky? I'm going to be this like moderate, compassionate conservative. So once again, that is another change election. 2008, Barack Obama, like, hey, you know, I'm not going to be divisive. I'm not going to do Iraq the way George W. Bush does. And then, of course, 2016, Trump is the definition of a change election when he's saying, like, I'm going to throw out these bipartisan establishment bums who've driven this country into a ditch. And then Joe Biden is also, despite being one of the longest running politicians in American history, he's also a change candidate because he's like, whoa, I'm running against Donald Trump's divisiveness. So the thing that's weird about 2024 under this framework is this by definition, actually it would be, if Trump wins in 2024, this also would be a change election in the sense that like, hey, like just Biden just couldn't manage the economy. People were pretty happy where things were in February 2020. However, this is kind of a little different than the other change elections I've described previously because uniquely Trump is so Trump that and this is why I'm bullish on Biden. I just do not believe that a voter is going to sit in October of 2024 and say, like, I'm still mad about the price of gas 2 years ago. In a way they would normally, because Trump is just so Trump that they're going to think about something bigger than just that. And they're going to say, like, do I want Trump back in the White House? I think the change election thing would be much stronger if you had, and once again, I don't support Nikki Haley, but like, I think a Nikki Haley or a Mitt Romney type would have an easier time making the like, look, guys, let's just vote on the economy. Are you happy with it case? Because it's just going to be entirely different that way. So I guess what I'm kind of getting at is I understand why young people who like didn't even have the 1990s glory days. Like, so I'm 31. I'm just old enough to remember the 1990s, right? When things feel like everything's together, things feel low stakes. That was a really great time to grow up in. And then obviously the 2000s, especially after September 11th, the Iraq War, just frankly kind of turns the country to shit in a lot of different ways. And we're still trying to fix all of those problems. But a political skill set that you need to develop, and this is why I'm so jazzed that like you're reading Landslide and that people like you are interested in these topics and you're listening to my podcast deeply, is I actually want my listeners to understand how politics works.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if they understand how politics works, they will understand the way by which they could actually systemically change things. Because if you just kind of start with whatever, and it's like, I appreciate the compliment. Like the key thing that you said at the start was the reason why like my politics are slightly confusing for people. Like once you listen deeply, it's like pretty clear where I stand on these things. But the reason why I think my politics is confusing at first is I work to be very fair. And I work to be a realist. Like I think I could articulate very concretely like how like a Trump person feels about these issues. I could say how a leftist feels about these issues. I could say how a center left Biden person feels about these issues. That is where politics has to start from. This is just not an era where we could start from. Here is just my like aggressive position, and my job is to like impose that position on reality. I think that does very well in media. And this is also why it's confusing for Gen Z, right? Because I think it's probably confusing to watch a Bernie Sanders like TikTok talking about systemic change in January of 2020. It's just doing huge numbers, and to talk to your friends and everyone's kind of like bummed out, but then have Joe Biden win. There's just like a contradiction between the way media works and the way actual reality works. And my kind of point of the realignment, why I'm like really comfortable making it like an academic facing project, is like, no. Like seriously, like there is an LBJ somewhere there. I really mean this. There's an LBJ. There is an FDR. There's a Ronald Reagan somewhere. And these are once again the category of leader, not their individual politics. You could have a left version of Ronald Reagan, but you get what I'm saying. Like Western wear, it doesn't have to be a conservative thing. But I think they would be the people who I'd say you need to listen to my podcast, because if you think this is about you going viral on TikTok, you're going to be deeply mistaken.
I love the way that you framed that answer, because I think that a common political frustration for people my age is that things have just always seemed pretty bad. I know you've mentioned Time for Kids before on the realignment, which sort of unlocked a memory for me. And I remember reading Time for Kids in 5th grade and seeing like people in military uniforms in the desert and just knowing we were at some sort of war and I didn't really understand what was going on. And I think that people my age are a lot more politically conscious than any generation beforehand at such a young age. And I think that part of it isn't even intentional. I think just with social media, everything is in your face. Like my girlfriend, for example, will just be scrolling on TikTok and watching like cute little animal videos. And then she'll randomly come up on something about Israel and Palestine. They'll be like very dark and like personally upsetting. And out of nowhere, it's just suddenly there, And I think that sort of like short form media, I know that you're not necessarily a fan of short form media, but I think that in particular, it can get people very sort of jazzed up about a political issue without really involving without the sort of nuance that it would have. Like it makes things a lot more black and white, and it makes people very frustrated. Like, oh my God, this is so clear. Why isn't something being done about this? And I think that this leads well into my next question, because I came to the Realignment podcast, I believe it was about 2021, as someone who thought he knew a lot more about history and politics than I actually did. And suddenly I'm hearing you talk about supply chains and semiconductors and all these important policy issues that I never really comprehended or even heard that much about, just because they're not as sexy as like a war or something. And I've always been very impressed by how well informed you are on such a complex array of topics. To reframe this a little bit from how I was originally going to ask it, how do you think that in a I guess in a time of like bite-sized information and where nuance might be a little hard to find, what do you think are the most important policy issues for people who want to engage in politics? Like, what should they try to understand? And what do you think are the best ways to try to understand it? Or I guess if I were to put it more bluntly, like how the heck do you keep track of all this? You know?
Yeah. So I said this earlier and I can make it a little more concrete. I'm obsessed with the idea that oh, actually, no. And this is where I'll praise Joe Biden. Joe Biden, despite all of his very obvious flaws and personal and political weaknesses, Joe Biden is a great politician in that he is so good at developing a theory of the case for what he's doing and how he's trying to do it. So critically, you have all these guys and gals in 2019, they're running for president to, overthrow Trump. And, Beto O'Rourke is kind of going up there saying, we're going to take your guns, which is just like, I'm a Texan now. Just don't, just don't.
Yeah.
Maybe like politics is about, and the thing that's funny is I'm not even like critiquing his he could believe what he wants to believe, right? And I get why he believes what he believes, but the notion that like that was a smart play on the national stage and considering his ambitions in Texas was just dumb. And that just isn't it. And there's like a skill set as a politician. But then you have like basically that was emblematic of, you had all these Democrats who were like, oh my gosh, like Donald Trump is the president now. So basically there are no more rules. Like we need to like be more, I don't even want to say extreme because like that's a pejorative. That's a negative term. It's like, okay, Trump is here. He's upending everything. We basically need to like scramble what we believe. We need to go like more to the left. We need to go more to the right. They're just like very unmoored and kind of dashing all over the place. But what Joe Biden said was like, hey, like Charlottesville and that march was scary and it was bad. And actually, most Americans find that really off-putting. And that's not the way they want the presidency to be. So my theory of the case for my campaign isn't going to be that I'm going to be like the most Medicare for all person, or I'm going to be the most like this or that person. He was just sort of like, hey, I'm Joe Biden. I'm boring. I'm normal. Aren't you kind of exhausted of American politics? And that was it. Like that was actually a brilliant political assessment. Going into 2022, everyone thought the Democrats were going to get wrecked by the red wave. Joe Biden, and I was, the Breaking Points tape is there. I was like, oh, look at Joe Biden. He doesn't know what he's doing, talking about democracy and the stakes and focusing on abortion, culture wars. They're going to get wrecked. No, Democrats overperformed because he was correct. Joe Biden is very good at identifying the theory of the case here. And obviously, like his running again is his last test. Like he has made the calculus that he is the strongest against Trump out of all the Democratic alternatives. So like, we'll see if he pulls it off. But like, once again, key skill set. So how does this relate to actual listeners? What I want actual listeners, left, right, or center, to do is not start with, no, of course, know what you believe, right? Like André, I want you to know what you believe, but actually like take some time to take a step back from those beliefs and develop like an assessment of the theory of the case when it comes to American politics. And this kind of thought I have is actually developed from Shinzo Abe. So he was the recently assassinated Japanese former prime minister at the time. I've got a book on him back here, but I did an episode on him right after the assassination. I was kind of like reading about him. And in 2006, 2007, I believe, he gave a speech where, and this was just like, the thing about Shinzo Abe, I did an episode of Arsenal of Democracy about him. I think you'd actually really enjoy it. I'll send it your way. It's about Japanese politics and history. But he is so smart for a politician in a way that American politics hasn't really elevated of late. Like he's genuinely just like an intellectual statesman who is capable of constructing frames. And this frame was just so brilliant. So he was asked, and he gave a speech where he said like, look, here is my mission in Japanese politics. Japanese politics have been defined by the post-World War II era. It's about us coming to terms with like militarism, our relationship with the United States, The fact that we're no longer trying to become a superpower by means of war, but by our economy. It's in our constitution that we can't be militarized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all great and that's all fine. However, my assessment, and this is me speaking as Shinzo Abe, is that the world that Japan faces doesn't look like the 20th century. It doesn't look like the 1980s and 1990s, where we're trying to buy up, property in New York City, and Sony and Toyota are wrecking the American electronics and auto industries. But it actually looks like the 19th century, where we have rivalry with China, where there's peril, where you have great power conflict and competition, where we have to be afraid of war again, where we have to deter conflict. And my mission as a politician is preparing Japan in the 21st century to weather 19th century conditions. When I read that, I was like, oh my God, that is just so brilliant. Because once again, that is a mission. That's a theory of the case. And once again, there's actually like so much. And what I love about this is there's all sorts of left, right, and center policy debate you could have within that framework. Okay, like maybe part of the way that you prepare for the 21st century is you like make healthcare in Japan better. Maybe you make the supply chains more resilient if like the US and China have a conflict over Taiwan. Maybe it's this, and that. Maybe they need to change their immigration policies. Maybe they need to increase their birth rates. Maybe they need to have more robotics for automation because their birth rates are declining. Therefore, they're going to have less workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just like an initial framework that I think is very smart, very empirical, and lets policy emanate from. So what I want listeners to do is, what is your own theory of the case when it comes to America and what we need to actually do? And once you have your theory of the case developed, it's actually so much easier to know what to focus on. So here's like, once again, I'm kind of stealing Shinzo Abe's like thing here, but like my take here is the 1990s were this unprecedented opportunity. We could have done all these things with it, and we just kind of blew it. We had two back-to-back presidencies that blew the opportunity to build and unify America, Clinton and W. Bush. And rather than think our job as young people is to come in and like systemically, magically, and actually kind of magically, and I use the word magical because it's unclear where these majorities actually come from to impose change. So it's the opportunity isn't, I'm going to win 61 seats in the Senate and pass universal health care, or I'm going to get, 65 seats and we're going to abolish the electoral college, or we're going to admit Puerto Rico and DC as states. The actual unifying political opportunity is, hey, America isn't ready for the 21st century. Our supply chains are a disaster. Our higher education system is a disaster. It literally like isn't preparing people. Like you're seeing like the higher education system like kind of collapse. Like seriously, like it's kind of crazy. Like people, the costs keep going up. You see this example in like housing. You see this example in like energy. There are all these actual categories, infrastructure, where there actually is bipartisan consensus. The problem is all of those topics where there's consensus are not TikTok topics. You're not going to go viral on TikTok talking about semiconductors or talking about supply chains, talking about our energy mix. You can kind of on housing, but you get viral on TikTok doing doomer housing takes, not like an actual like, no, like how are we actually going to do this? So like my actual point is, because I have this theory of the case, I could actually say like, okay, once we actually kind of repair the potholes, literal and figuratively, then we could transition to the comfort where you could actually have more systemic change. But I'm just kind of curious how you would kind of think about this framework. What would be like, what would be your like kind of initial like theory, and like where would that lead you?
See, I am so psyched about that answer that you just gave, because I think it speaks to a frustration that you and I both share, which is, I think you spoke a little bit on this point about political doomerism. And as someone who sort of occupies a lot of left-leaning online spaces, that's something that I in particular have been so frustrated with. The other day, I saw this ridiculous tweet where there was a question like, do you believe Israel has the right to exist? And then the person replied, I don't even believe the United States has the right to exist. And I was like, oh my God, how do you expect to get elected to anything ever? Like, I'm so sort of frustrated by this notion on the left of like America bad, America bad, America bad. And I think there's such valid criticism of how the United States has like behaved in an imperialist sense, like overthrowing democratically elected governments. But you're never going to get elected. Like you're never going to appeal to middle America on this sort of like, I guess, just like trying to sound like more radical and more smart than the next guy. Like if I think you've talked a lot about like how unpopular of a slogan defund the police was. Like that's just a guide to how to lose every single election that comes up. And I think that like especially with the Shinzo Abe point, I think that a lot of people, a lot of young people are just like I don't want to sound like an old man or like, oh, I'm so special, but like I just feel like so much of it is impractical and so far away from this sort of like how are we going to get elected. Like I was a big Bernie Sanders person, and I remember like debating someone a few years ago who was like a communist, and I was like, hey dude, like Bernie Sanders can't even get elected, like you might as well sort of like embrace that and those policies and try to do it in a practical sense, because I don't, it's just that sort of fundamental frustration there. And I think that, oh man, I kind of lost my train of thought there. But I think that
See, being a pundit's
even
harder than being an interview. This is what I was saying. It's way easier to ask questions and have someone ask questions of you.
yeah, I mean, it's just like so many like other good questions and responses come up like while you're responding. But I think that even like you touched on how like academia is sort of crumbling, and as someone who only like very recently graduated from college, I remember being in these political science courses and things coming up that I've heard touched on like on the realignment and other online spaces like in such detail, and sort of being familiar with that, and other people who were like in high level poli sci classes, like fellow political science majors that just had like like fundamental idea of how government function and about American history in that way. And I remember like, because this segues really well into my next question actually, because like I recently graduated with a political science degree, and when writing these questions I realized how great of a companion piece the realignment had been to my poli-sci education. In a lot of ways I think that sort of like online media kind of carried my poli-sci education, honestly. And I remember learning so much about Francis Fukuyama, who you mentioned earlier, and the sort of end of history in my entry level courses, and not finding it particularly like engaging. But fast forward to last year when you had Fukuyama on the podcast, and I felt that you presented it in a much more interesting and compelling way that it had been presented in the strictly academic space. And as someone who considers himself more of an academic, how do you think a platform like podcasting can be utilized in academic spaces in a way that could make it more engaging to college students? And another point on that before you answer is just COVID started during my second semester of college. So a lot of my college experience happened to be online, unfortunately. And I know the difference between listening to like a 45-minute pre-recorded lecture by my professor versus like sitting down and listening to Marshall talk for 45 minutes. So if you could sort of articulate that point, I guess.
Yeah. So a couple of things here. Really psyched to hear that, because once again, like that's what I'm trying to. So here's how podcasting can be useful. I think as a creator, I have a theory of the case here, and basically, like my theory of the case is I'm trying to do every single thing you just said reflects that. Like I think I'm accomplishing my mission, in that like because I think some episodes of the realignment are more entertaining than others. But like I saw on like Reddit, someone was like, on the Breaking Points forum, they were talking about like the realignment, and they're like, oh, I don't really like listen as much anymore. It's not as entertaining as it was during the lockdown. And the thing that I had to do, like that used to be really tough for me to hear. But I had to actually like take a step back and think like, okay, great. Cause like you're actually not trying to be purely entertaining. Because what I'm actually trying to do, again, you're my prime listener. So I was psyched to do this episode with you, because my show is for people who actually want to figure out how the world works and kind of delve deeper in that. And like, guess what? Like, That's actually not very entertaining. Like at a pure level, it's actually like not as entertaining. Diving deep on like semiconductors or learning how like monopolization and financialization works in the defense industry, like my episode today. But and this is why I say I'm talking to like a future FDR or an LBJ, they would understand that's actually important. Like they would actually understand that so much of what exists in political media today is basically empty calorie performance and basically isn't going to help you actually think and act throughout the world. I mean, dude, I had this thought where like, and this isn't like dunking on Crystal or Sagar, but I was on this stage with them too. When I was doing the live show, Breaking Points Live from DC during the 2022 midterms, and the Democrats basically Republicans took the House, but Democrats did so well that the loss was basically a victory. I was like, oh my God, because we did a bunch of live shows. I was like, if you purely consumed our episodes and our live shows, you just would be totally confused by what just happened. Like every single thing we said was like super entertaining. We made all these jokes. They were super funny. People laughed. I really like performing live. I like making jokes. It's really entertaining, but it actually did not serve the audience beyond basically convincing them that they were hearing something smart and useful when it wasn't actually. I think it's like decently smart. Like we're definitely at the top percent, like of this category. We're at the top, frankly. But like it still just wasn't correct. So like for me, it's like, look, if you're coming to be entertained, like plenty of podcasts to go there. But I actually think if you were someone who in 2027 you woke up, because here's the thing about 2027, why that year matters. Even if Trump wins again, you're just gonna have a total open space, open nomination for the Democrats, open nomination for the Republicans. Either way, that is going to be the most fascinating year in American politics. And what I want to do is kind of like put out a series of podcasts that just would help someone say like, okay, hey, like this is how that works.
Yeah, I think that touches on a really interesting sort of commentary on politics as infotainment, I guess. And I hate that term. I wish there was a better term for it. But I think there is a difference between just like content that is strictly like informational versus content that is entertaining. I'm someone who enjoys Breaking Points a lot, and I watch it on a daily basis. But sometimes I'll see like the thumbnails and the language in it. I'll be like, man, like, what, like that framing isn't really the best. I feel like that's a little sensational. But I also know that's the sort of nature of journalism. And on the point of the live shows, you guys got to come to Miami. I've been waiting for you guys to come to Miami for a very long time.
Yeah, I'll pitch that to Sagar. They're actually like a huge pain. It's actually like the thing. It's actually really fascinating. So like, you have to do so many live shows to make it economically make sense, and everyone's like so busy. But it's easiest to do like 3 or 4 of them. But to actually make it work, you have to be like a comedian and do like 12 shows, and that's just like not happening. Like there's just like we'll see what happens in 2024.
Yeah, the logistics of that must be a nightmare. But I guess as we get closer to wrapping here, because I know you got to go soon, for my last couple questions, I guess like on a more personal note, like from what I've understand, you're someone who grew up really interested in politics, and fast forward to today, I've seen you interview important figures like Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Andrew Yang, among others. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to transition from being an outside observer to actually participating in these political circles?
It was honestly, it was. I'm trying to find the right way to put this. It was interesting to do the transition after 2016 because in 2015 and beforehand, which is like when I first started interning in DC, there was just a lot more belief that those people in power were, and I need to modify this statement after I say what I'm about to say, were inherently correct. But now, after 2016, when everyone was just so wrong, it's impossible to go back to that pre-2015 framework. So when I interviewed Andrew, so let me put it this way: if I'd interviewed Andrew Yang in 2015, I'm like, oh my gosh, like Andrew Yang, one of the first like internet candidates, like this, and that. But that's in 2016 when you have like the framework of like actually like no one quite actually has the answer. I'm just kind of figuring it out. It's much easier just to kind of just be skeptical. Be like, yeah, Andrew, like you're kind of like wrong about everything. Like you're a nice guy, but actually this is all totally wrong. Like the New York mayoral campaign was wrong. I think the Forward Party is wrong. I think the Civil War talk is wrong. I think the lack of wearing a tie is wrong. He'd be better off wearing a tie. There's a reason why you wear ties. Aesthetically, like that's a whole other episode we could get into. The point actually is though, is that like it's so, and like once again, like I really liked interviewing Senator Rubio. I think he's actually gotten much better at podcasting. It's like kind of funny to listen to his episode that I did that back in June versus the episode in 2020. But the thing is, like, he's kind of figuring it out too. So the exciting thing as a young person right now should be, oh wow, like if I read, if I study, if I think, I could actually come up with answers that people older than me can't just dismiss because they're older than me. Like we're in a crisis of authority, and that's like a huge opportunity. The problem, though, and I think this really, and this really infects Gen Z circles and certain types of millennial circles, is they take that authority crisis as license to basically think there are no rules and you can think whatever you think, and everybody's like, whoa, like dial down. Like that's what everything I just said leads someone to overreach and conclude defund the police is a good term to use for your policies. So you have to balance the act of, okay, I shouldn't just wait my turn. I can accept the idea that people generations above me are incorrect, while also thinking, okay, that doesn't also mean that they're wrong when they tell me, hey, defund's probably not the best way to articulate it. Because like, you've seen this, like there actually is a personality type. And this is actually I think this is actually a problem for politics right now. I love your articulation of what's happening with like your girlfriend, because the nature of politics and media, and specifically the challenges of this political moment, has politicized a bunch of personalities who frankly have no business like running or engaging in politics. People should vote, like knock on doors, support your candidate. But there are a bunch of people who are like giving like political change agent takes and frames where, like, once again, dude, you've read Robert Caro's books. What's so great at Robert Caro's book is you're like, oh man, like there is a political mind. Like there is a person who you insert them into the political system and they can understand and comprehend. There is a certain hyper politicized person who should honestly be in entertainment. They should be in comedy. They should be in business. They shouldn't be in politics. And by politics, I mean like, you know, capital P politics. How do we come up with the strategy to make change? Like the person that came up with like defund the police, they should probably be in like niche marketing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, because think about that. Like, defund the police was kind of, it's both brilliant and it's dumb, which is that and also the same thing with like abolish ICE, like Sean McKeely. Those are brilliant in that they are marketing terms that really activate a core group of people around a cause. That's great. But that's not quite what politics is, especially if you're operating from the left. Because if you're operating from the left, what you're actually trying to do is, hey, how do we, and this is a challenge to any of your listeners who are kind of like coming from that left communist perspective. Here's the political challenge for you this decade, this century. The suburban Democratic voter just kind of decides where things go right now. You know what? Like, how do we convince them to move towards our politics? That's the central challenge. That's not up for debate. That is the actual challenge in our electoral system. Defund the police, abolish ICE doesn't get you there. Something else has to. I don't quite know the answer. I'm not a leftist, so it's not my job to come up with the answer. But like my point is, the person who solves that challenge is not the person who comes up with niche marketing, but does well on Twitter and podcasts like defund the police.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point because, like, from my own perspective, I've always thought that the way to sort of implement more progressive policies is sort of the opposite of a lot of what I see articulated, which would be to frame them as being more patriotic, sort of like a legacy of like American like New Dealism, like FDR or LBJ, like the dream of a single family income, for example, stuff like that, that would sort of, I think that's one of the most clever things that Donald Trump did, was make America great again as a tagline, because people got to apply whatever they wanted to that. Like I agree with something that Kyle Kalinske, I believe, articulated, which was like, hey, if there was like a Donald Trump type figure who was like rude and brash and saying that on the left, like we would probably love him. You know, like we would probably
but and this is why I always disagree with Kyle. On the like, that candidate would not win the nomination because that style off-puts. I love Kyle. Like I was at his wedding. Like I adore, like people always say this, like whenever I'm on stage or on like the mic with Kyle, I have like this like smile, because I really just like love like engaging with Kyle, because like in no world should like an academic type person who works at a conservative think tank be interacting with Kyle Kalinske. So like whenever it's happening, I'm almost like meta level laughing. I'm like, this is absurd. It's so especially when you think of Kyle's old 2011 tweets. People look them up. It's just very funny. But Kyle's like a really great guy, and I get really mad when people attack Kyle. I'm being like totally serious. I get like viscerally angry when people attack Kyle. He, like, last thing on this, he's like one of the few people in like online media who you meet and you're like, wow, you were just like yourself. Like he's like such like a deeply authentic person, and I just like can't stop praising him enough. Now that I've praised him, I'll talk shit. Dude, that's just so wrong. Once again, I said the core of the Democratic Party are suburban, white, millennial, Gen X, and boomer moms, and black voters in the South. Those two constituencies want nothing to do with Cenk Uyghur saying brash, aggressive things. They don't understand. And once again, because I think they've legitimately been caught in a media warp where they're not thinking. Like I did an episode with Cenk, and he was like talking about how like, oh, like he gave this anecdote where he was talking about, and this was in his most recent book where he was talking. We're extending a few minutes if that's okay. Where he was where he was talking about how he was frustrated by polls that indicated that black voters in the South supported Medicare for All and Bernie Sanders' agenda, yet they actually didn't vote for Bernie. They voted for Joe Biden. And in the book, he says, quote for quote, this is just evidence of how like MSNBC and CNN are giving everyone brainworms. And I got like, so, and I have, and this is why I'm just not in the pundit game. Cenk just totally like steamrolled me. He's just like aggressive and like brash in a way that you just aren't. And I think the type of circles that I run in. So I didn't make this point as eloquently as I should have, but I was like, dude, like, where's the evidence that like working class to poor black voters in Mississippi are like turning on MSNBC and saying, hey, like MSNBC, like Chris Hayes, what should we do to determine our voting? No, it's that the style of political performance that Bernie is performing, that Cenk is performing, does not appeal to black voters. It's that simple. And that's what I mean by them not understanding politics. And the other thing you have to understand, and I always get in this fight with Kyle, just because you have a poll that says 67% of voters believe X of Medicare for All does not mean they are going to vote on Medicare for All when it comes to their actual electoral point. That's the crazy talk thing. The basic polling was always there. Yes, it's true that black voters are probably to the left of economics from like center left, center space, the kind of space I inhabit. However, what was the thing that actually mattered to them in 2020? It was defeating Donald Trump. So they said to themselves, are we going to vote on Medicare for All, or are we going to vote on the candidate most likely to vote for to beat Donald Trump? And that was Joe Biden. So this is what I mean by like, there's just this online space. And this is just like the last bit of this rant here. And this is what I actually get really angry about this, because the more you study this, and I'm sure you've had this experience, right? Like, I think the more, because you've clearly like gone deep in my catalog, the more you study these issues seriously, I think the potentially angrier and angrier you get, because you're like, man, everyone is just joking around. Like the stakes right now are so high, and people who say who say they're treating things as high stakes don't actually treat things as high stakes. Like, my pushback to Cenk is, if he actually believed the stakes around a democratic socialist revolution were as high as they are, he would understand how basic polling works and not just like write clickbait books that don't mean anything. So I actually just get so angry because I'm like, no, like, because I think the stakes are high, I spend all my time figuring out how things are. I think the stakes are so high that I sacrifice my ego and limit my views by doing wonky academic books that like don't like do numbers the same way. And guess what? Like, I could wake up not filled with cope because I'm like, oh, you know what? Like, there's around 30,000 people every single episode who find that super useful. And actually, if you think about that, for an academic type, that's incredible. Like, those are huge numbers. Like, it's actually crazy. And like, obviously, like, we do bigger than that sometimes, but just getting 30,000 people every single day to tune into like a wonky ass conversation on like how we could learn lessons from Belgium leaving the Congo in 1960 and like the CIA's overreach is like crazy. And that's so exciting, but that's me taking it seriously. And my challenge for people like Cenk and like Kyle, who I think are operating in good faith, I think they've just been infected by like the internet, is to take yourself to your logical conclusion, actually figure out how the world works, because that's what actually needs to be done here.
I really appreciate that answer because I actually listened to both the Cenk episode and the episode about the African leader that got assassinated yesterday while preparing for this episode. And I, like, even as someone who's more politically aligned with Cenk, during that episode, I was getting really frustrated at him. And I don't know if that's just like, despite being a politically progressive person, I'm kind of like a moderate in spirit. I'm sort of like a moderate.
It's a disposition. Here's the thing, and this is you actually have the right thing. A moderate disposition in this moment is actually super important, which is different than your policy views. Like, that's the that's the key thing. So sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh no, of course. I think that sort of like in that moment, just. Well, because I guess to sort of revisit the point that I made that you pushed back on, I think I, like, in rambling, I kind of conflated two things, which was one, sort of making, like, more leftist policies sort of like in a patriotic vein, which I think is something that would actually have like electoral success, versus like a more bullish Trump type figure on the left. That's something that like young people would probably appreciate. I think that's more so what I was trying to articulate.
And one quick thing, because I want to follow up on this, is this is actually an example of how academia and academic concepts really harm the left, which is that, like, if you just sit for a second and think empirically, social change at a policy structural level in America happens via pro-American like dynamics. New Deal, Great Society. Look, once again, leftists aren't going to be happy with Obamacare, but Obamacare is definitely moving the country in the direction of where I think leftists would want politics to actually transition. That's coming from a pro-American perspective. Like, there is this actually like literally no example of like doomer, directionally like anti-American, oh, like I've read my Howard Zinn and I could point out always like, because the thing that you basically need to do here, and once again, like, you know this, despite me being a dude who has a podcast called Arsenal of Democracy and who is focused my career on the Pentagon, I have plenty of critics of American power on the podcast. So I do this more than anybody, like literally than like no one else. And what's so funny is every time afterwards, they're like, oh, well, like, I thought I was going to hate this podcast, but you're actually like super fair and interested. Because once again, like, I actually think it's super important that I, as a person who's pro-America and wants America to back Taiwan and to back Ukraine, to actually understand the downsides of my position and understand, like, dude, I do all these episodes on the war in Iraq. It's because the war in Iraq needs to be foisted in front of me at all times for the rest of my life. I mean, because I didn't support I was in 5th grade, so I don't get any credit for not supporting the Iraq war. That's my joke there. I'm like, well, it's like no credit. But my actual point is, like, I need to, whenever I say X, Y, and Z policy, I need to explain, like, why, look, this isn't Iraq because X, Y, and Z. And it's really frustrating to see people who hold my positions not be able to do that accordingly. But yeah, the quick thing is just like the understanding that, like, you can both read Howard Zinn and critics of American foreign and domestic policy, but politically understand that is not actually how you translate power. This is kind of what I mean. Like, people who read Howard Zinn and make that the centerpiece of their politics should not be political operators. Like, that's what I mean by people. Like, they actually should not be political operators. They should work in academia. They should have niche podcasts. They should have newsletters. It's really exciting this ecosystem could exist. But you have to understand, you should not be whispering into the ears of people who are trying to wield political power. But sorry, go on to your broader point.
Oh no, I actually wanted to touch back on that sort of commentary about like pro-America sentiment and how like criticism of American policies versus that pro-America sentiment can sort of exist in these spaces. Because like I'm a Brazilian American immigrant. Like I was born in Brazil, moved here when I was 3, and I went back and studied there for middle school. And I found myself actually really resonating with something that Sagar articulated, which is like, oh, if you don't like America, leave. Like, leave, see what it's like, and come back, and you'll have a different appreciation for it. And like, even like in like my own frustrations with like immigration policy, for example, I'll be talking to people and they'll be like, yeah, like America's bad, like they shouldn't treat you like that. And I'm like, yeah, but like that frustrates me, because it's like, no, my family like did a lot, like worked very hard to be able to come here, like to be able to have this life that is better. And the idea that like when I articulate that struggle, for someone to be like, yeah, this country's so bad, isn't it? And then to get that sort of frustration, like, no, it's not actually. Like, I tried very hard to be there. So I don't know if that's sort of where like my pro-America sentiment can kind of come from. And I don't know how much time you had left. I had a couple more questions, but
yeah, I've got like, let's do it till 30, so like 8 minutes. I'll give quicker answers.
No, don't worry. I really, really appreciate the long answers. Honestly, the nuance is incredible. But I guess sort of moving on to like a little bit of a different topic. A friend of mine, Akai, is actually a really, really big fan of yours, and he's particularly obsessed with the idea of meeting people our age that want to run for office. We joke around a lot discussing like who would or wouldn't make a good politician. And I wanted to ask you if you've ever had a run-in with a politician or aspiring politician that you found particularly impressive, and what sort of political quality they had.
Yeah, so the politician that most has impressed me, I've had him on the show a couple times, is Mike Gallagher. So he's Wisconsin 8th Congressional District. He is the chairman of the China Select Committee. And what I find so impressive about him is he's just like a smart guy. And I think I think this is actually a problem for a lot of our politicians right now. There are different moments in our history where different skill sets. This has been a theme of our episode. Like, different areas of history just like require different skill sets. So, for example, like LBJ was famously not a well-read guy. Not a well-read guy, like, at all. Very, very, very proud of that dynamic. But I actually think, like, if we're talking about the set of challenges that I'm describing here today, like, oh wow, like the post-World War II international order is literally collapsing in front of us, and we have to come up with answers to that. Or, oh wow, like supply chains, or oh wow, like the Pentagon and defense, or oh wow, like healthcare, oh wow, generational turnover. Like, this moment actually requires political actors, I think, to be intellectual and bent, because part of what the electorate is asking of you, without actually asking it for you, is to offer summations and offer actual answers to things. So I like Mike Gallagher because he actually is smart enough, and he's actually doing this work. We were doing this episode, and he was talking about like the Korean War, and he had this book by T.R. Fehrenbach. It's called This Kind of War. And he's like, oh, sorry, I'm gonna grab this book. And he grabbed the book. He's like, I'm so excited about it. And he's like, oh, sorry, I'm like, this is just like nerdy and unhelpful. But I'm like, no, like, Congressman, this is actually good, because this is actually the type of, because the point is, there's a lot of the world today looks a lot like the way the world looked before the Korean War. So studying the Korean War is actually like a really, really interesting thing. He had a foreign affairs article about this. But I actually like want more politicians who can both like get elected, but like think seriously and think academically, like in that sense. That's like a majorly important dynamic.
I I really appreciate the way that you answer that because I think that's something that I haven't really articulated. I haven't really like put into words, but I do think it's a sentiment that I agree with. It's funny if you look at sort of like our most academic president, like Woodrow Wilson, for example, who I would argue was like particularly like badly suited for like his moment in history. So I think that really does resonate with that sort of different political strengths for different times.
Oh, and
So
quick thing. I don't just mean, but this is the key thing though. Um, Woodrow Wilson is literally like an academic, right? So he's a famous professor. He
mhm,
is, president of Princeton University before he becomes governor of New Jersey. I think he was like too academic-y in the sense that
mhm.
he was too much like in the clouds, and also like let's put aside his views on like segregation and all sorts of like obvious bad stuff. But like he actually was bad at the job because he was just too academic, head in the cloudsy. So the word I'm looking for isn't academic in the case of Rep Gallagher. It's intellectually curious.
Okay.
And I actually think that today LBJ's lack of intellectual curiosity would actually be a huge problem because today, because look at LBJ. LBJ like doesn't come up with the Great Society programs. He doesn't come up
Mm.
with like a lot of these ideas. And actually, if anything, he definitely doesn't come up with the Vietnam War and is ill served by that. By the way, did you listen to my episode on JFK with Fred Logoval?
I did, and I actually liked it so much that I read the entire book since our last conversation.
Yeah, and this is a good place to be near our closing because, like, hey, people, we need to read this book.
I love
Because
that
like,
book.
because it's like, it's funny. They're turning it into a Netflix series.
Mhm.
Because JFK genuinely, as a young person, like around our age, is like such like an interesting person, and that's what I mean by like he's like writing, but he's not like an actor. He's just like thinking about like JFK is spending his childhood and his like pre-politician years thinking about the moment and the issues of the time. And that's what Mike Gallagher is doing. And we need more politicians who could do that. Because the problem with LBJ is LBJ has the skill set dispositionally to turn the levers of power and the knobs and the dial and to, pressure Joe Manchin, but he wouldn't know what to do. Right. Because of his lack of intellectual curiosity. Like he
Mhm.
wouldn't know how to say, like, because look, if I were, and by the way, I think this is where we're all close. Because I said lots of good things about Joe Biden. Here's Joe Biden's political failure. So this will be like my kind of like my closing rant because I'm also developing this thought, so it's just like good practice for me. So look,
Mhm.
Joe Biden, if Joe Biden doesn't win, no, actually, whether or not Joe Biden wins re-election or not, um, I think he has failed because during the campaign, he identified the right theory of the case, as I said. He identified people want normal. They think the fact that I'm old and out of touch and not on Twitter means that I'm not going to do it. No, actually, it's why I'm going to do it. I'm the guy who, when Gen Z woke staffers tell me to not include Thomas Jefferson quotes in my speeches, I say, yeah, no go. I'm going to include like great theory of the case. However, when he came into office, and I'm thinking about this in the case of FDR, because I'm sure you've done FDR biographies and FDR books. The thing that's incredible about FDR is so many A-list people, figures of his age and his era are in his administration. George C. Marshall is the chief of staff of the army. You have Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's dad, as ambassador. You have all of these like major figures of the time working and fixing and addressing the problems. Like think of Eisenhower. Just think of all these incredible. FDR is this guy who's just assembled this huge set of people to attack and solve the country's problems. Joe Biden's fundamental problem of his presidency is he does not have the ability to do anything like that. Here's what I would have done if I were in the White House in 2021. I would have said, look, Joe Biden, you're super old. But guess what? That's actually part of the reason why you got elected to the office. So like, because I did this funny episode with like Eric Weinstein, where Eric Weinstein was like, "Oh, Joe Biden's so old, needs to pass the baton." I'm like, dude, that would mean passing the baton to Kamala Harris. And on every single issue you actually care about, Kamala Harris would be worse than. So like, let's chill. So him being old is a strength, but there's a weakness. He doesn't have the energy. He doesn't have the dynamism. He is not going to be able to make Americans feel good about themselves the way they need to really feel about things. So Joe Biden should have adopted the FDR model and basically said, look, I'm going to level with the American people. I'm not here to convince them that I'm like the second coming of like energy and vigor. And yeah, I trip, I stumble. I am your responsible grandpa on one last ride who's assembled the greatest crew of people America's seen to attack the challenges that we're facing right now. So I'm going to find the guy like, hey, Gen Z, you don't feel like you have the chance to get a house or get the American dream. Oh, I'm going to find the guy to do that. And he's going to be energetic. And it doesn't have to be a cabinet secretary, but this person is just going to be on it and working on it. And like, that's the whole deal. Because guess what? I can't do that the same way. But what I can do is after 50 years of political wisdom and knowledge winning this election, I know how to like know people who can move things. Like Pete Buttigieg kind of gets at this, but I actually don't think the problem with Pete is that Pete's problem is he is an excellent press secretary, but like, I don't think he actually like, I don't think anyone looks at our country's infrastructure problems and thinks like, yeah, like that's the guy who could kind of like fix it. But like, think of Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban's incredibly popular. He, you know, sold his stake in the Dallas Mavericks, and everyone right now is thinking, oh, is he going to run for office? What's the super popular thing that Mark Cuban did? When Mark, like a few years ago, he started his cost plus drugs company, like this nonprofit that's attacking the cost of pharmaceuticals. Joe Biden should have said, hey, Mark Cuban, you definitely don't want to be Health and Human Services Secretary. Would you be interested in like taking like an unconventional part-time role in this government, where your basic job is to figure out what the hell is going on with healthcare and how we can actually fix it for people? Biden could have done that. That is a theory of the case. It's saying, I'm not going to be vigorous, I'm not going to have energy, but I'm going to find the people who are going to do that. I think that is a version of this actual presidency that could have made people feel better about themselves, right? Because that's the underlying dynamic, and that's kind of the problem. But instead, he just selected a bunch of like traditional politicians to take these cabinet officer roles without the ability to give people like the consequent confidence and energy they actually needed. So I think that's where I'll close things. But I think this has been super great.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, because I think it really speaks to both Joe Biden's like fundamental flaw and his greatest strength is that he is a traditional politician. So like in some respects, that's what makes him like the most electable, the one who actually becomes president. But in others, it could be his just downfall in this political era. I guess just one final point to wrap on is last week when I got my Spotify Wrapped, the Realignment was actually my top podcast. And right above the little say thanks button, there was a little text that said, let's turn this into a two-way conversation. And we already had the plans for this interview. And I just thought for a second, like how lucky I am to get the chance to talk to you here and that you would give the time to my channel and to talk to me. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts. And we should do this again sometime.
No, we will. And this is really fun. But once again, like this is kind of my theory of change here, which is that, let me put it this way, and this is where this isn't me shit talking, but it's actually just serious. Like Joe Rogan gets so many views, zero influence on politics. Elon Musk gets so many views. He's the entrepreneur of our era. He's predicting that Republicans are going to dominate the midterms, and he's just totally wrong. So I think what's kind of happening here is everyone is over prioritizing like reach and not focusing on depth. And I think even though you're a small YouTuber, I actually think the conversation and the videos that you're doing and like the circle of friends you have and the people who are watching your videos are actually the right people. So I wish I want to like, hopefully we could like work together on this. I actually just think we need to build more spaces that are kind of dedicated to like these serious things, because that's what's actually kind of under leveraged, right? Like think about it this way, like, Moneyball, where like there's this whole idea of like, oh, like they're focused on this big one thing, not on this small thing. The Moneyball opportunity here is everyone politically is focused on like for example, like I don't know if you saw this, but Taylor Lorenz, I keep saying I'm going to end, but I'll actually close on this. Taylor Lorenz did this piece on like Ro Khanna doing his like streaming from the White House with like all these big like YouTubers like Destiny and Vouch and like everything. What's totally wrong about that inclination is that's like the Moneyball mistake. Like the future of our politics does not come from making Vouch or Destiny happy. Like the actual future of our politics, I think, is like, here's what you actually have to do. You actually have to develop, once again, and this is, I think, what our work is kind of focused on in our own ways. You develop your theory of the case by being serious, and then you find a way to like popularize it through Vouch and through Destiny. But if you just kind of follow the big view generating thing, you're not going to actually get anywhere. So that's just what I'm kind of like thinking about. That's what I'm kind of like work towards. But Andre, this has been really fun, and we will do it again sometime.
No, I really appreciate it, Marshall. Thank you so much for your time. And everybody, if you're not familiar with Marshall, I'm sure you'll check him out after this interview. You seriously do some of the most thoughtful work on politics here on YouTube that I've seen, and I think that we would be a lot better off if we had more people like you.
Yeah, and I will actually say this, given the fact that you said this on YouTube. The podcast is audio first, so like it was actually really funny. There's this guy Armand who's in college, and he's like really, really, really like great. He helps with like our YouTube channel, but he just like DM'd me one day. He's like, "Hey, dude, like I love your work, but like it's such a bummer that this great episode only got like 1,000 views." It's like, no, dude, like it's audio first. Like the 99% of people are listening on Spotify and podcasts. So my own way, I need to like actually just kind of like make that clear.
Yeah.
And actually like in 2024, I need to like step up the YouTube side of things. But I'm sure you know, YouTube and like podcasts are actually just like so different, but it's kind of like intimidating and so like difficult. Like I hate thumbnails. I'm never going to do the open mouth thing. Like, I'm just not going to do like Mr. Beast face with like the Congo CIA overthrow thing. So yeah, it's just a funny place to end, but thanks for having me, man.
No, of course. I think I'm just someone who usually tends to watch the content on YouTube. I think I go on Spotify for the Supercast episodes because they're on there, and I really enjoy those. So, you know.
Okay.
But I guess I'll talk to you another time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Adios.
Bye. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching, and a special thank you to Marshall Kosloff for his time and his thoughtfulness. I really enjoyed this interview, and I would love to hear what you guys thought about it in the comments below. If you made it to the end, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, because I hope that you enjoy the content on the channel. I've got a lot more things coming soon, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks again.